and welcome to the 12th episode of Toke TV, your source for the latest and biggest cannabis and hemp news. I'm your host, Steve Elliott. I'm editor of Toke Signals.com, and I'll be guiding you through the news again this week. First, though, let's look at our bud pick of the week. This week we have a gorgeous photograph from an anonymous farmer somewhere in Colorado. He calls it Colorado Sunset, and I think that is a wonderful name for this beautiful picture. Now, we have just a couple of news items that we want to look at, actually about 7 of them, and we have some big things going on in the cannabis world this week. In Colorado this week, we have a really silly ordinance that is being looked at by the Denver City Council. Now, as you'll recall, Amendment 64 was approved by an overwhelming majority of Colorado's voters last November. What Amendment 64 did was legalize limited amounts of marijuana for adults over 21 in the state of Colorado. But as some politicians unfortunately tend to do, certain politicians have been busily working ever since, it seems, to undermine the intent of the voters when they passed this law. And the unfortunate ordinance that we're looking at in Denver right now, under its terms, you could get a year in jail just for the odor of marijuana. If you're smoking one of those so-called legal joints in Denver and this ordinance passes, your neighbor happens to notice that aroma, yeah, you could be in trouble. That's kind of bad news. If that legal pot you're smoking smells like pot, it's not legal anymore. Seems kind of silly. This ordinance will be introduced at Monday's City Council meeting. And of course, it comes in advance of the legal marijuana sales, which are scheduled to begin in Colorado in January. Now, this ordinance does some other unfortunate things as well. The ordinance would prohibit pot smoking in parks, and specifically prohibit pot possession in the 16th Street Mall. And it would also ban toking in private property if it is visible to the public, quote unquote, such as on your front porch or in your car, or, as I mentioned, if the odor of cannabis can be detected from neighboring property. Your activities should not pervade others' peace and ability to enjoy, said Denver Mayor Michael Hancock. Marijuana is one of those elements that can be quite pervasive and invasive, the mayor claimed. I shouldn't have to smell your activities from your backyard. The mayor didn't explain why we should have to smell his intolerance from ours. If the ordinance is approved by the city council, the mayor will sign it and it will take effect immediately. Offenders could face a fine of up to $999 and a year in jail. This ordinance is a tremendous overreach, ill-advised, unnecessary, and unconstitutional, according to Mark Silverstein, legal director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Colorado. Now, according to Silverstein, the ordinance would ban consumption of marijuana in the privacy of your living room if the window is open or if you can be seen from the street. Now, actually, it's even a little worse than that. The smell of marijuana could conceivably seep outside even if the windows aren't open. Silverstein said that it will inevitably prompt police and community confrontations. Amendment 64 was said to regulate marijuana like alcohol. This is not regulating at all like alcohol. No one risks a year in jail for drinking a beer in their fenced-in backyard, Silverstein said. And as for banning mere possession anywhere on the 16th Street Mall, I cannot believe Amendment 64 allows cities to make it a crime to carry a legal product in your pocket as you walk on a public sidewalk or public right-of-way. In November, Denver will ask voters to approve a 3.5% sales tax on marijuana that could be raised to 15%. A statewide ballot question is also asking Colorado voters to approve a 15% excise tax and a 10% sales tax that could be raised to 15%. Now, the Denver City Council just last month approved an exhaustively stringent set of new rules and regulations for retail marijuana businesses. Denver is one of the few cities in Colorado taking steps toward legal pot sales to anyone over 21, approved by state voters as Amendment 64 passed last year. The specific ban on marijuana in parks would nix Denver's massive annual 420 celebration. City officials are continually vexed by this huge smoke-in. They worry that the city will lose uptight tourists and offend families if public consumption of cannabis is tolerated. Mayor Hancock said the event itself would still be allowed. It's not that he's a nice guy, it's that he can't shut it down due to free speech issues. But pot smoking in the park will not be tolerated. The organizers are going to have to think long and hard about the kinds of risks they and their patrons will be taking by deciding to puff up at the park, Mayor Hancock said. We are not going to tolerate it anymore. It's done. We want to make very clear, now and forever, and that is zero tolerance. Apparently, Mayor Hancock's cheery campaign slogan of "We are all Denver" doesn't apply to cannabis consumers. Isn't it ironic when, quote unquote, marijuana legalization results in a new law that can get you a year in jail for smoking marijuana on your own property? And as if that wasn't enough, this brand of legalization, quote unquote, seems to somehow be taking down a hallowed 420 tradition for good measure. Over in Michigan this week, the state Supreme Court is eyeing local bans on medical marijuana. This historic case will determine whether Michigan communities can ban medical marijuana and possibly whether state residents can keep using cannabis at all for medicinal reasons. Those united against medical marijuana patients include the State Bar of Michigan and the Prosecuting Attorneys Association of Michigan. Both of these groups are trying to get the entire medical marijuana law thrown out. That would cancel the wishes of the 63% of Michigan voters who approved the medical marijuana law 5 years ago in 2008. Groups opposing the medical marijuana ban and supporting patients include the American Civil Liberties Union of Michigan and the Libertarian Cato Institute based in Washington, D.C. A few Michigan communities have passed bans on medical marijuana that carry serious penalties, including jail time, according to activist Tim Beck of Detroit. The ordinances didn't even mention medical marijuana. They just said that any activity that was illegal under federal law was also illegal in their community, according to Beck. The Supreme Court case stems from retired attorney John Turbeek's 2010 lawsuit to overturn a medical marijuana ban in Wyoming, a suburb of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Turbeek is a state-registered medical marijuana patient with a painful neurological disorder and diabetes, according to the lawsuit. Now, he lost in court, but then he won with a 3-0 ruling in the Michigan Court of Appeals. Last April, the Michigan Supreme Court granted the city of Wyoming, Michigan's request to appeal. Livonia, Michigan passed an almost identical ban ordinance and has filed a brief siding with Wyoming in the appeal. Bans have also been put in place in Birmingham, Bloomfield Hills, and Lyon Township in Michigan. Turbeek said in 2012 that he sued because he feared he would be arrested if he grew or used medical marijuana for his conditions. I've tried narcotic-based drugs like Vicodin and OxyContin, he said, and nothing worked like medical marijuana. I couldn't just sit by as our elected officials try to ignore the will of the people and take this option from me and thousands of others. The Court of Appeals ruled that Wyoming's ban was preempted by Michigan's medical marijuana law. It also said local governments could not use the federal drug laws as an excuse for ignoring the state's medical marijuana law. Congress can criminalize all uses of marijuana, but it cannot require the state to do the same, according to the Michigan Court of Appeals. Now, a brief supporting Wyoming, Michigan, filed by the Prosecuting Attorneys Association of Michigan, these guys are your enemies, remember them, ignores that, claiming that Michigan's medical marijuana law stands as an obstacle to the accomplishment and execution of the full purposes and objectives of Congress and is therefore preempted. The State Bar of Michigan is just as bad. Its public corporation law claims in bold type, the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution applies to void Michigan's medical marijuana law in its entirety. The Michigan Municipal League is also an enemy of medical marijuana patients. The Lansing-based lobby group's brief says that Michigan cities should be free to zone and regulate their own unique land use activities to ban medical marijuana. In Massachusetts, the word isn't much better. We have there, last fall, of course, they passed a medical marijuana law. Once again, with overwhelming support, 63% of the people voted for it. But now there in Massachusetts, doctors in one big chain are being advised not to authorize any patients for medical marijuana. Doctors at community health centers there have been advised not to authorize any of their more than 638,000 patients for medical marijuana because the centers are afraid they'll lose their federal funding. The Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers advised its 36 federally funded facilities to stop issuing patient medical marijuana authorizations under state law because cannabis use remains illegal for any purpose under federal law. Health center physicians who authorize patients for medical marijuana could be committing a potential violation of federal law and could result in legal and financial exposure for community health centers, according to a spineless statement from the league. Voters approved a ballot initiative last November, making Massachusetts one of 20 medical marijuana states, plus the District of Columbia. Federally funded community health centers in other states have also advised doctors against authorizing patients to use marijuana. Also at stake in this case is a possible loss of malpractice insurance, according to the community health centers, because that's covered by a federal program known as the Federal Tort Claims Act. Additionally, should a community health center doctor be convicted under federal law for authorizing a patient for marijuana, the group claims the physician should be shut out of the Medicare and Medicaid programs, which cover many who use the centers. The National Association of Community Health Centers said it was unaware of any center or center physician anywhere facing any federal sanctions for authorizing medical marijuana. But apparently the threat of prosecution, or more likely funding loss, is still a factor to these folks. Community health centers have been providing access to care for decades, but there is no assurance that they would not come under federal investigation or that their physicians would not face trouble for certifying medical conditions under state medical marijuana programs, given it's an unsettled area of the law, said attorney Catherine Watson of Felsman Tucker Leifer Fidel, a DC-based law firm that advises the national group. The community health center's stance very likely undermines the goal of Massachusetts state regulators who wanted lower income people to be able to afford medical marijuana. Many of those with lower incomes, of course, get their health care at these community health centers. Back in July, a medical marijuana patient named Gary, who asked that his last name not be used for fear of losing his publicly subsidized apartment, received notice from the health center that his marijuana authorization was being rescinded. The center was worried about losing federal funding, which accounts for about 10% of the facility's money. Paola Ferrer, who directs grants and development at the Austin Health Center, said the organization can't risk its federal funding by writing marijuana authorizations for a small number of patients. We are really tied to the federal government and the funding stream, and until the legal issues are adequately resolved, we are not at liberty to do this, Ferrer said. Patients at Veterans Affairs facilities also face challenges getting medical marijuana authorizations. Physicians at VA hospitals are prohibited from completing forms seeking recommendations or opinions regarding a veteran's participation in the state marijuana program, according to a 2011 memo from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Better news this week from the Southwest. A poll in Texas shows 58% of voters there support the legalization of marijuana. More than 60% of those surveyed expressed support for removing criminal penalties for marijuana possession and replacing them with a civil citation similar to a traffic ticket. Now, 58% for legalization for regulating marijuana like alcohol, according to this public policy polling survey released on Tuesday by the Marijuana Policy Project, is a strong majority. Only 38% of Texans said they were opposed to legalization. Marijuana prohibition has been just as big a failure as alcohol prohibition, said MPP Executive Director Rob Kampia, a part-time Austin resident. Most Texans agree that marijuana sales should be conducted by legitimate businesses instead of drug cartels in the underground market. This poll also found that 61% of state voters support removing criminal penalties for possession of up to an ounce and replacing them with a civil offense punishable by a fine of up to $100 with no possibility of jail time. Only 30% said they were opposed to that idea. Now, under current Texas law, it is a criminal offense for a person to possess a small amount of marijuana, and he or she can be sentenced to up to a year in jail and fined up to $2,000. Law enforcement officials' time would be better spent addressing violent crimes instead of adults simply possessing marijuana, according to Campia of the MPP. No adult should face potentially life-altering criminal penalties for using a product that is significantly less harmful than alcohol, he said. There is ample research demonstrating the medical benefits of marijuana in the treatment of several debilitating conditions, according to Campia. People suffering from cancer and multiple sclerosis should not face the threat of arrest for using medical marijuana if their doctors believe it will help ease their suffering. Down in Uruguay, another positive development, as we've been following the interesting effort down there to become the first nation on earth since 1961's single treaty on narcotic drugs from the United Nations to fully legalize marijuana. Hard rock legends Aerosmith were in Uruguay for a concert Wednesday night at Montevideo, and they praised President Jose Mujica during an official visit Tuesday afternoon. Aerosmith singer Steven Tyler called Mujica one of the best presidents in the Americas, and he added that more presidents should be like him. Tyler expressed admiration for Mujica's work on marijuana legalization and helping the poor. Uruguay is on track to become the first nation in the world to fully legalize cannabis since the Single Convention Treaty on Narcotics established worldwide marijuana prohibition in 1961. And that was the doing, of course, of Harry J. Anslinger of the DEA. Your president is a freedom fighter, and in many ways, we fight for freedom ourselves with music, Tyler said. He gives 70% of his salary for people's homes. Here in this small country, Uruguay, I think he's doing it the right way, grassroots, and we believe in that. Now, President Mujica, he's a former leftist guerrilla, and he's widely considered the world's poorest president. He donates most of his Petro program, which provides free homes to the country's poor, mostly households headed by single mothers. This program also provides free medical care. Mujica has already given more than $300,000 out of his pocket to this program. The visit between Aerosmith and Mujica was arranged following a request by the rock band to the Executive Tower, Uruguay's presidential office. The band visited with the president for more than 2 hours in public and private events, and they stayed around long enough to watch the Montevideo sunset. And at the end of the visit, Aerosmith gave the president a signed guitar. An amusing yet dismaying story from Colorado. Conservatives there apparently are quite upset about liberal ideals like legal pot and gay marriage, and they want to secede from the state of Colorado. Yeah, those wacky conservatives. Next month, 11 counties in northern Colorado will vote on whether to secede and form their own state, in which they plan to promote conservative ideals that residents say have been lost in a progressive era of legalized marijuana and gay marriage. The 51st state initiative would create a new state called New Colorado or North Colorado, and would reject all that liberalism that has created such policies as legal cannabis, gun control laws, immigration reform, and modernized marriage laws. I would have never believed the state of Colorado would become this liberal, complained Lyle Miller, who owns Nan's Convenience Store in Cheyenne Wells. I'm afraid for my grandchildren. I want them to have the same heritage I had. Now, this move sprung up in the aftermath of the Aurora movie theater mass shootings in 2012. Of course, those prompted the Democrat-controlled legislature at the time to pass the state's first new gun control laws, which require background checks on private gun sales. That stirred up the Republicans and conservatives and led to a successful recall campaign by gun advocates to remove 2 Democrats from office. who had supported firearms laws. So the 11 counties are holding a vote on whether to secede from Colorado and work toward forming their own state based on conservative ideals. What we're attempting to do is restore liberty, said Jeffrey Hare, a leader of the 51st State Initiative, although making marijuana illegal again doesn't sound much like liberty to us. Even if the counties do declare to leave Colorado, the state must then vote to allow them to leave. After that, Congress would have to vote to admit a new state, something it hasn't done for a breakaway state since West Virginia split from Virginia back in 1863. Some of the supporters say that they would settle for annexation into Wyoming. It's just going to be seen as a crackpot idea by a bunch of crackpot commissioners, some of whom are term limited, said Steve Mazzarana, a former political science professor at the University of Northern Colorado. Some will just call it crackpotopia. Democrats have dismissed the movement as a publicity stunt by disgruntled conservatives who are having trouble adjusting to modern political realities. They say that secession is just a sideshow, but analysts say the drive represents a widening gap between rural and urban Colorado. Speaking of whack jobs, North Korea's leader is often seen as one on the national stage because of his repeated blustering and threatening to use nuclear weapons against the United States and other targets. But there's one thing the North Koreans have over us. In North Korea, marijuana is legal and available at the food market. There may not be much freedom there. It may be a totalitarian communist dictatorship, but they do have one freedom that most in the United States don't enjoy: the freedom to openly buy and smoke marijuana. Cannabis, or ip tambe, which means leaf tobacco, is reportedly grown openly on the roadsides and smoked on the streets of Pyongyang, but local North American tourist guides normally won't let Western tourists see that side of Korean culture. Freelance writer Darman Richter recently wrote on the Bohemian blog about his experiences buying and smoking weed in North Korea earlier this year. Cannabis is used by the working class there, both for its medicinal effects and to unwind and relax. Richter was able, with the help of a North Korean intelligence officer, to get into a food market in which locals shop, but where Western visitors normally aren't allowed. We were just walking past the tobacco sellers when we spotted another stall ahead, piled high with mounds of green rather than brown plant matter, Richter writes. It turned out to be exactly what we first suspected, a veritable mountain of marijuana. After buying the cannabis, Richter bought rolling paper at a tobacco seller and started rolling up and lighting comically oversized joints in the middle of the market. In the name of scientific inquiry, it seemed appropriate to buy some, he said, and the little old ladies running the stall were happy to load us up with plastic bags full of the stuff, charging us roughly half a pound each. Cannabis isn't even considered a drug in North Korea, according to Richter. It is grown in large plantations and also grows wild abundantly on the peninsula. Richter's Korean guide seemed a little embarrassed that his group had discovered the abundant legal marijuana available there. They seemed to be ever so slightly uncomfortable with our discovery of their special plant, no doubt aware of its legal status in our own countries. It was their job to make sure we saw a positive representation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, he writes. I don't think they had planned on chaperoning a giggling pack of red-eyed imbeciles around their country's proud military monuments. North Korean marijuana apparently isn't very potent, though. This is cannabis which has been grown naturally in mountainside fields, Richter writes. While the flavor's all there, it'll take a few well-packed joints before one starts to feel anything approaching the effect typical of a Western crop. That said, at prices like these, some might not consider that a problem. Before we go, there are a couple of must-read stories that you really want to check out on TokeSignals.com this week. First of all, a 2012 study that shows medical marijuana reduces suicides. It suggests that legalizing medical marijuana lowers suicide rates by almost 5%. And this is a scientific study. It is potentially very important. You want to check it out on TokeSignals.com. The second must-read of the week is medical cannabis does not increase and may decrease teen use. One of the reasons that anti-medical marijuana people often name is that they want to protect the children, or they want to keep from badly influencing teenagers to think that they should smoke pot. Well, state laws allowing for the legal use of medical marijuana by qualified patients do not increase teen marijuana use, according to this study. And if anything, they decrease teen use or have no effect at all, according to data published online last year in the journal Annals of Epidemiology. So you want to check that out this week on tokesignals.com. Educate yourself. Knowledge is power. I hope you have a great week. Join us next week for episode number 13. And until then, as always, stay lifted.